remember as a little kid, every time we went to Moosehead to Greenville, we always had to stop at the hill and get out and look. Every time.
We're just about ready to celebrate our 25th anniversary. That's what.
All right, well, why don't we go ahead and get started then. So first I'll introduce my Can you all hear me?
Yep.
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 You can hear me, okay. So I wanted to introduce myself. My name is Laura, and I'm the director here at Shaw Public Library. Thank you for joining us tonight. We have here Steve Pinkham joining us. He is an author. He has written 3 books, Mountains of Maine, Old Tales of the Maine Woods, more Old Tales of the Maine Woods, and he also has a monthly historical column in the Northwoods Sporting Journal. He is also on the Maine Woods, and he began visiting Moosehead as a small boy, visiting his grandparents who lived in Rockwood. So I will let Steve go ahead and introduce himself.
Hey, hi everybody. My grandparents were originally, my grandmother's from Rangeley, and my grandfather was from Swanville down by Searsport. And they moved up, after they got married, they lived over at Rangeley, Andover, and eventually moved to Rockwood because my aunt and uncle, Phil and Eleanor Ladd, lived in Greenville, had moved up there. So my grandfather worked up at the sawmill in Rockwood. So that's where we always went. A couple little things I remember about as a little boy when I went up there, 2 things that happened. One is my cousin Kathy hurt her finger. We went to the town doctor and he was gone. So we went up to the junction to a house with a little lab in it. And it was Doc Pritham. He was in his 80s. I was just 5 years old. He fixed her finger and then he gave us lollipops.
Wow.
That's what I remember. The other thing I remember, about the same time, we went to the bank, which was right across from the library, the old bank building, went in to make a deposit or something, and there was a businessman there. He said, "Here, I'm going to let you hold this." And it was an envelope with $5,000 on it. In 1959, $5,000 could buy a house. So anyway, let's get on with this. This is going to be about the early history of how people got there, how they fished and everything. So let's go. Next slide. Okay, here's a timeline. The first account we have is of Colonel Montressor, a British general, not a general, an officer. He was actually an engineer. And he came down from Quebec and came over into the West Branch, down the West Branch, over through West Carey, and down into Moosehead, went down Moosehead, and then down the Kennebec, all the way to Fort Halifax in Winslow. That was the first people he saw that whole trip. And he had, but unfortunately, 2 things happened. One, he was afraid that the French would get a hold of his journal. So when he came to places like Kineo and other places, he left them blank. On the other hand, we probably would have got the wrong names because he had Mohawk guides with him, not Wabanakis. So he left those blank. And then he went down. He made a map, but unfortunately, it's of the Great Carry from Kennebec over into the Dead River and up through. But he did leave us that map, but he did not map Moosehead for us, unfortunately. That same year, the state of Massachusetts, the Commonwealth, hired John Small, a captain from Cape Elizabeth, to go up to Halifax and measure the Kennebec River. He took a small crew with him. He went up the river. He started at Winslow, and with a chain a yard long, they measured all the way up to the forks. You can go to the next one, please. Next slide. There we go. That's Montressor. And his map, this is Yeager's map of a little later, 1822, but you can see roughly what he saw. Because at this point, Yeager didn't put anything specific in there because that's 2 years before Nathaniel Haskell settled at Greenville. So there really wasn't anything there. The other thing is he was so afraid the French would get a hold of his journal, but they didn't. Benedict Arnold got a hold of it instead and used it against the British when he went up through the Carry. Next slide, please. Okay, there's John Small. And this is the map he made. And you can see that he put just a little bit. You can see the loop 3/4 the way up is the Dead River heading off to the left. Just above it, near the top of the map, you can see a little bit of the foot of Moosehead Lake. At least that's how we thought it would look like. And he put a note in there. He put from this pond is supposed to be a short carry place into the Penobscot River. Next slide. The next person that we know that visited the lake was John Ellis. And he was quite a character. He was from down east, more down below Augusta area, but he moved up to Guilford, moved his family to Guilford. He went up there when he was 18 in about 1808, roughly. And he fell in love with the lake. And he built the camp. This is not his camp, but it's what his camp would have looked like. We don't have a picture of that. But he built it at Lily Bay. We know that. And he was a hunter. And I found this over time in the census. When somebody is listed as a hunter, it's an occupation. Remember, they didn't have refrigerators in the early days. And these hotels had people in them and they had to have meat. So the hunters would go out and hunt bear, deer, moose, whatever they could get, birds, everything, and go to the back of the hotel and sell it to the cook. Would then have to do the butchering and the defeathering and put it in soup and whatever he served that night at the hotel. And it was a constant job to supply meat because there was no way to get meat there. There was no railroads or anything, no refrigerated cars, anything like we have. We know quite a bit about him because in 1868, a reporter from the Somerset Journal in Skowhegan went up to Kineo, and he said he was watching, and he looked out across and he saw a sole canoe paddling toward him, and he knew who it was, and it was John Ellis. He had ragged clothes, a long beard, hadn't shaved or showered or bathed in a long time. But everyone came out of that hotel, the whole crowd, and welcomed him like a rock star. They brought him into the hotel, sat him down, and all sat around him waiting for his stories because he told tall tales. And we have a couple of his stories. At the end of his life, when he was in his 80s, he got very sick, and he came across in the winter across the ice down to just above Greenville, but he caught pneumonia. Someone found him. They took him down to Guilford to his son-in-law's house, and he lived about 2 weeks and he died. Buried in Guilford. But he was the first one. I also have another account where some young men from Harvard went up to Kineo. And they say as soon as they got to that hotel, they went in to the dance hall. There was a big hall. They just ignored everyone else, went for a beeline across that room to this little man sitting there with a beard because they wanted John Ellis as their guide. That's how popular he was. Everybody wanted him.
Mhm.
And he is the first Maine guide out there that we know of. He's out there long before anyone. At least in the 1830s, he's starting to guide.
Huh.
Next one. Next slide. Okay, Hiram Rockwood. Now, Hiram Rockwood was a surveyor, and he went up to Moosehead, and he actually went around all the islands and made a map of the islands of Moosehead for the state of Maine at that point. That was about 1826 or to 28. And then he came up again in 1830, but with that, he just left a description of the islands we have. And then when he came up in 1830, he spent several weeks, and it was winter. It was early May, but it was still a lot of ice in the lake. But he left us a journal with this. So we have his journal from day to day, everything he visited. He went all the way up to the Moose River, and he discovered there was a boom, a chain boom across the river for catching logs. But it was in pretty bad shape. It hadn't been fixed for quite a while. But you can see from the notes I've written from his journal that he got there, examined the boom across the mouth of the Moose River, and returned to Birch Point Camp, 25 miles that day, paddling. Next one. Okay, so actually the next person that would come up there was Charles Landman. He came in 1845, the year before Thoreau, and he left us a good description of his trip. He actually went up to northern Maine and visited Aroostook, and was one of the first people to visit up there as a visitor. He was an artist and an author, and he left us a nice account of his trip to Moosehead. The next year, Thoreau went in 1846, and we have his account, of course. You can find it right on the internet. And James Russell Lowell, which is also he was a Harvard professor of literature from Cambridge. Now, the interesting thing with this is Thoreau took a train to Boston from Concord. He took a steamer all the way down east to Bangor. And then he took a stagecoach. This is his Chesuncook trip in his book. He took the stage, made it all the way to Monson, and he had to stay overnight at Monson. But we knew how many hours he'd gone. He wrote that down, and the next day how many hours it took to Greenville. And his total trip was 16 hours in a stagecoach.
Wow.
He mostly stayed on the outside, not the inside, because he wanted the fresh air and the scenery. Now, in 1853, James Russell Lowell, he started in Waterville, got on a stage, it went up along the Sebasticook River and went over to Newport. However, on the way, one of the spokes broke in the wheel of the stagecoach. They looked around. The stagecoach driver went over to a fence, a wooden fence, took one of the posts, whittled it down, and made it into a spoke, and they were on their way. And had to go to Newport, then to Dexter, and it took him 18 hours total. So without that breakdown, it probably, we figure it probably took both of them about the same amount of time to get there from Bangor and Waterville. Next one, please. Okay, the first hotels at Greenville. The first hotel was the Subumic House, opened in 1835 by James Gower. He cleared a spot and erected a two-story hotel. And it was quite interesting because his two-story hotel was one of the only buildings there. There was a store, a couple houses, a blacksmith shop, and that was about it for Greenville at the time in 1835. The Eveleth House opened by John Eveleth in 1850. And this is a picture of it. He made a lot of money. He actually owned the Chesuncook House. He was involved in lumbering. He had his fingers into about everything in the whole area, and an entrepreneur. Next slide, please. And next we have the Kineo House, built in 1848 originally as a tavern, but it had an upstairs so people could stay. And this is a drawing made by Madame Groselier about 1856. So it's only 8 years after. It's probably romanticized quite a bit. But remember, before the steamboats, they did have to use sailboats. And it took a long time to get to Kineo because the wind had to be right. Soon as steamboats came in, that changed the whole scenario. There's a lot written about Kineo. I have a notebook, complete notebook of just articles about Kineo, and another one of just pictures of Kineo, because it was very popular. A lot was written about it. One of the men that ran it, A.O. Denon, he ran it for almost 35 years. He was the head of the hotel. Some of the interesting things of that hotel, every time it burnt, 3 to 4 times, it would get rebuilt larger. And at one point in the 1890s, there were as many as 100 guides working out of that hotel. The demand was so high when people were there in the high summer. Next slide, please. So these are some of the other Bigney's Hotel, Hines Hotel, Eveleth House, Stage House, Lake House, Deer Island House, Sandbar Farm, and Cary Hotel. Next one, please. And then we continue up to 1891. There were more after that, but I'm cutting this off around that date. The Roach River House got built, Shaw's Farm on Second Roach, Northeast Cary, Savage's Tavern, which became the Winnegarnick House, Wilson Pond House, West Cove Hotel, the Bluffs, Morris's Lower Wilson Pond House, and Roach River again, and Milton Shaw's Lily Bay House. So there were quite a few. You see, in those early days, they didn't have sporting camps at Moosehead. They had hotels, and they had a lot of hotels so they could accommodate all the sportsmen and other visitors. So the sporting camps didn't actually get started here until the 1890s, whereas in other parts, such as Rangeley, they go back to 1870, the oldest one that's still operating. Next slide, please. Now, the steamboats. Through those first number of years, there were a number of steamboats plying on. They were both used for booms, to bring the larger ones would be. Twilight was a smaller one. It wouldn't be used for that. This was mostly for transportation of people and goods, because this is how Kineo got a lot of its goods supplied. And the other ones would be used to help with the boom, like the Katahdin is up there now did. And that was a windfall, because before that they had to use capstans. Anyone heard of a capstan? It's like a turntable with arms, and men would walk around that, and it winds up the boom they have to bring those logs and get them down from Moose River to the Kennebec to go down to the mills in the cities down there. But once steamboats got in, that ended, thankfully, because that was grueling work. So you can see there was the Moosehead, ran for 10 years, the Amphitrite, the Moosehead second one, Ferry of the Lake, Lumberman, The Mist became The Daydream. Twilight, The Governor Colburn, and The William Parker. And I recently found an article that talked about these, and he told exactly when each one of these was built, which was wonderful to find. Next slide, please. Now, how did people get there? Well, the first magazines for sportsmen started at about 1870, American Sportsman. And that was bought out by Forest and Stream, not Field and Stream. Field and Stream started in Chicago, and they kind of did the West. But Forest and Stream out of New York and Boston, they people started writing in those, writing articles. People would get those magazines, read those articles about places to go. And at first, they would use regular travel books, which told you when the trains got where they went, when they got there, the stagecoaches, the timing, the rates and everything, just like a regular guidebook today. But then in 1874, John Way, a young man from Boston who traveled all over the Maine woods, made his first map of northern Maine. And he did a pretty good job. And all the subsequent maps were used that as its base. Farrar had written, Charles Farrar had a steamboat over on Rangeley, and he made a guidebook to Rangeley, and then he went and also made a guidebook for Moosehead in northern Maine. And that ran from 1878, it got updated about every year till about 1890. Next slide. The next one was Hubbard's Guide to Moosehead Lake. Now, Lucius Hubbard, we have a book from him. He traveled all over northern Maine as well, wrote this guide. But the important thing with this guide is the back chapter. He actually got all the Wabanaki names of all the lakes in northern Maine, and he lists them in the back with a definition of what they mean and how to pronounce them and everything. It's one of the best we have that early. Thankfully, he did that. Thomas Sedgwick Steele also wrote a couple books about his trips canoeing from Moosehead and down the Allagash and the Aroostook. And he created a map as well in 1881, which helped because it's very interesting that the visitors always wanted a map with them to know where they are. We still do that today. But then Wabanakis didn't use maps. And it struck me one day, I finally got it. When you look at the names of their lakes, the meanings are literal. Like the name of a lake here could mean sandbar, outlet between two sandbars. Literally mean that. And you automatically know by the name of that lake, the definition of it is how to get out of that lake, where that outlet's going to be. And they just knew the names of lakes, and that in their language, that told them what to look for. They didn't need maps. The map was in their language. Next slide, please. All right, the Lily Bay and Roach River regions. Just a couple pictures of places up there. Opened as Keene's Tavern and became the Roach River House. And then the Lily Bay House, opened by Milton Shaw, became quite an establishment. But he was a big lumberman, so he also used it for his lumbering as well, because he had to supply hay and for his horses and oxen and everything. Next slide. Okay, Northeast Cary. Originally, there was Morris's Tavern in the early 70s. That was on the other end of the Cary on the West Branch. But then John Ross's Cary Hotel ran for a few years and then was taken over by Savage's Tavern under Simeon Savage, who ran it for another 8 years or so, 5 years or so. And then he changed the name to the Winnegarnick House. And he ran it for those years, and then others took over. And it ran for a long time, the Winnegarnick House. Next one. Oh, we got one that slid sideways. Okay. The wharf, this is the wharf at Northeast Cary. The top of Moosehead is very shallow. If you've ever gone up there in a boat, you know that it's incredibly shallow. You can take a boat in, but a steamer boat couldn't get there. So they had to build a wharf way, way, way out that the boat could get to and let passengers off and goods and stuff. And eventually they built a track along it. But some of the early descriptions in the 1860s and 70s is this rickety thing that you were afraid to go on. But they would have to get their canoes, get their luggage over there. So they would use it. Now, unfortunately, this slipped sideways in the screen, but that is the Ox Railway. Across the Cary, there's a road today. There's been a road for a long time. But this was an ox railroad built by Boggs and Strickland, excuse me, it's actually, who had a lumber operation up in Seboomic area. They built a railroad. It's not a railroad as you think of it. It's actually cedar logs linked together. And an inverted car with inverted wheels would be like a wheel today without the rubber on it. And it would sit on that, and an oxen would pull it about 2 miles an hour, if that, 1 mile an hour, but would take you across, you and your canoes and your goods. And that ran from 1847 to 1862. 1862, some blueberry pickers were up there. They started a fire for their lunch. It got away from them and burnt over the whole Northeast Cary and took out the Ox Railroad. It was never rebuilt. Next one, please. So here's a picture of what it was like going across the Cary after the Ox Railway was gone. So Morris would come over in the morning because he knew exactly when the boat would get there to take their goods, their luggage and their canoes back across, and hopefully they'd stay at his house. This is a picture of the Seboomic house at Northeast Cary, what used to be there, which today is a campground, and a site of the old prisoner of war camp. Next slide. Okay, sporting camps. This will just give you an idea. 1894 is the first sporting camp we have listed because, again, the hotel serviced everybody prior to that. If you can call the Wilson's East Outlet House a sporting camp, then that becomes the second oldest still operating sporting lodge in Maine after the Middle Dam camps on Lower Richardson Lake in the Rangeley's. And after that, it would be Tim Pond camps in Dead River, 1878. So some of the others were the Crow's Nest by Big Knee, Cyrus Camp, Grant Farm, Hall Sandy Camp Farms, and others. Next one. And then the camps were built right up to 1905. More camps opened up after that, but the big heyday of the camps, these were the ones that we know about mostly. But when I was collecting a lot of this stuff, I live in Quincy, Massachusetts, and I go into Boston, and I went to Boston Public Library and used a lot of the magazines. And what I found was that about 1905, all of the information on Maine started to dwindle out. Because at that point, railroads, we'd gotten the railroads across the transcontinental to California. And now the spur ones are going up into Minnesota, Montana, Idaho, other places. And all of a sudden there was a whole new place to go fishing in Minnesota with land of 10,000 lakes and big game hunting. And all of a sudden the article switched from being about Maine and the Adirondacks, which was our competitor. And all the articles just seem to dwindle down, as well as the number of camps. A lot of those camps that opened up closed. To date, I have been collecting information on these camps, and to date, I have found 735 sporting camps in Maine. There were a lot of them very short-lived. The oldest lodge would be the Caratunk House on Route 201, Caratunk, that serviced fishermen and hunters. It's still open, and it's been open since 1816, over 205 years to date. Okay, that's my presentation. Now I'll tell you a few things about the fishing. That was the basis for people coming to Moosehead. It was mostly fishing. They did come here to hunt, but a lot of it was based on the fishing. I have a lot more fishing articles than I do hunting articles. The articles we have start about the 1840s. They were in newspapers, and we get quite a bit of information from the newspapers, particularly the Piscataquis Observer, and then the Bangor papers, and later the Waterville papers and others. But once those sporting magazines started in 1870, and there were a number of those, there were a lot more articles, a lot more information available about them. To date, I have collected over 17,000 articles on the Maine Woods. And I still find stuff every single day. Now, one of the things, the biggest help is if you have a computer at home, you can go on Internet Archive. It's a free website. It's where they put books. And you just put in Moosehead Lake and see what comes up. And all those guidebooks I just showed you will come up, and you can read them right online. So you can see all the pictures that Farrar put in his guide, and John Way. The other place you can go is to Osher Map Library. Just put Osher Map Library in your computer, and it'll come up. It's a little more tricky to work with it, but you put in Moosehead and hit search, and it will find all the maps of Moosehead through the years. And they can be copied, they can be used. They've made everything, they've digitized most everything and made it available to us. When I started this many years ago, there was none of that. I had to go into libraries and find this stuff. But today, a lot of the stuff that I copied is available today. The magazines haven't quite got there yet. Some of them have, but. So, do you have any questions for me? Okay. She's got to unmute you, Laura.
Oh, yep. You should all be able to unmute yourselves.
Just click on your the red thing at the bottom. It'll unmute you.
There you go.
There you go, Catherine.
Okay, so tell us, what kind of fish did they catch, and how deep is the lake?
The deep, I'm not sure of the actual footage off the top of my head, but the deepest point is on the backside of Kineo.
Oh, it is, okay.
Yeah, right on the backside of Kineo, there's a big pool area. by the
Yeah,
back of the
oh,
beach.
okay, yeah.
That's the deepest part of the whole lake.
Uh-huh.
I think it was what, 235 feet? Does that sound right?
Okay. Wow.
That is the deepest spot, yeah.
And what kind of fish? What were they?
They mostly salmon.
Salmon. Huh,
Salmon, yeah.
interesting.
Because salmon could get up here in the early days. You know, the dams were a problem created for them. They still are a problem for them.
Mhm.
But in the early days, I have accounts of people catching salmon
Hmm.
over 25 pounds.
Wow.
Those are the early years. They could
Mhm.
actually catch salmon that big.
Mm.
Trout, they could get trout, usually lake trout, togue. And those would often, those could run up to like 18 pounds.
Mhm.
Of course,
Wow.
as the
Mm.
fishing went on, and then
Mhm.
everything got stocked eventually to keep it going.
Mhm.
The fish
Mhm.
got smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller. I started to make spreadsheets. So when I find articles, I found somebody fishing and what kind of size fish. I put it on that
Oh,
thing.
that's cool.
So I
Yeah.
can cross compare and I'll see how
Yeah.
the largest fish, because everybody claims to have the largest fish, but
I like it.
you got to keep the record to do it.
Yeah. Very cool.
Any-
I have a question. How far reaching were the newspaper articles? You said that you found over 1,600, but how far away were these being published? What parts of the country?
Actually, 16,000 articles.
Oh, sorry, 16,000.
Yeah, a lot more. Well, the newspapers were basically, the magazines were basically printed in Boston, New York, and Philadelphia, and Chicago. But Chicago, they tended to write more about that area. But we had shooting and fishing, forest and stream, American Sportsman, Man and the Rifle. There was about 10 different magazines, some of them short-lived. The Forest and Stream was the big one, and that was every other week. And that ran from 1874 to 1930 when Field and Stream bought it out. So fortunately, they had all of those at Boston Public Library for me to sit there and photocopy and photocopy and photocopy. And then the ones I couldn't find, I was working at Harvard at the time, so I could get into Harvard and get their copies if I couldn't find something at Boston. So it worked itself out for me to get everything I needed to get. And I've kept contacts at Harvard. I could just make a phone call and get anything I want. So they'll look for it for me.
Thanks.
I have a comment and a question.
Yep.
The deepest point is 240 feet.
I was close, wasn't I? 235, I said.
Right, which is right under the 800-foot cliffs in the backside of Kineo.
Right. Yep.
And we own a camp up right next to Maynard's.
Yep.
And we've always had this discussion with people who have lived there their entire lives. We've been going there for 25 years. Is it Piscataquis or Piscataquis?
Piscataquis.
Okay.
Yeah. That's what I've always heard.
Okay.
Did you lose the argument?
I did. Yes, I did.
It's okay.
The interesting thing is the actual longest Wabanaki name we have is Spencer Pond. And Little Spencer Mountain. No, not the mountain, the pond. Little Spencer Pond next to it. It's like 28 letters long. I can't say it, but Chrissy, who used to run the camps, who has now sold them, Spencer Pond camps,
So I could see a little bit.
she could say it. It's very long.
No, thank you.
So,
Mhm.
no, what was the Wabanaki name for Moosehead Lake?
Sebec, or Sebem,
And what did that mean?
moose.
Okay,
But see, the first people that came through that we don't necessarily have records of it on them, we knew were some of the French Jesuit priests who came down through Moosehead. But again, didn't leave us a narrative about them. And they would often, on their maps, for French maps, call it Sebem. And then on English maps, it would be Moosehead. And it settled on Moosehead. So it depends on which maps you look at, because remember, Maine would be even though it was mostly controlled by, everything from Bangor down was controlled by the English most of the time. Everything beyond was controlled by the French through Nova Scotia, New Brunswick. And they kept trying to claim the whole state back and forth. And so their maps would reflect that back and forth, and the names would change according to what they wanted to call it.
So of course you have the little lake a little further south called Sebec Lake.
Right. And this was Sebem, but it's very similar in its meaning.
And you mentioned Mohawks and you mentioned the Wabanakis. Was there a large population of Native Americans in that area? And what was the relationship with the early settlers?
Well, the first attraction, of course, is Kineo, because it's rhyolite. It's a form, it's not flint, but it's like a form of flint in the family of flint. And they could use that for tools and weapons. So this was a meeting point for everybody, all the different tribes. Now, the Wabanakis were made up of a band of different ones. I mean, there were the Secocas on the Saco River. There were the Androscoggins over at Canton area, from Brunswick up to Canton on the Androscoggin, the Norgewogs on the Kennebec, and then the Penobscots and the Passamaquoddies further on. And so you had all these tribes converging at the lake. But the foot of the lake, where Greenville is today, was the camping ground and the meeting point for many of them. And even when Nathaniel Haskell got there in 1824, and his son-in-law, Oliver Young, they went out to Wilson Lake, and they lived on Wilson Lake because they couldn't move to Greenville because the Indians would occupy it and claimed it. And it was not for another 10 years that it finally started to get settled more as Greenville. That's all in Mary Calvert's book on the Kennebec. She wrote quite a bit about that. You can read that. It's called Dawn Over the Kennebec by Mary Calvert.
I actually have another question. There's
Mhm.
been lots of folklore about the cliffs on the backside of Kineo and Indian, either braves jumping off to prove they're being brave, or sacrifices. Do you know any of the stories of that?
The reality is that we don't really have a lot of Indian stories. That's the reality. We have a lot of made up Indian stories.
Right.
Which
Which is where folklore comes from.
Right. And I mean, I haven't heard of that. But I do know the story went around. I heard this even as a kid, and I've heard it ever since, is that a princess, a Russian princess or whatever she was, where she was from, fell off the cliff and broke her bones, but landed on a ledge, and they had to lower Henry Red Eagle down to get her body and bring it back up.
Wow.
I think she didn't live, but I can't verify that story. I can't find anything to verify it, even though it's out there in peripheral histories. You know what I mean? It pops
Right.
up occasionally, and it's like, but can't find any validity to it. Anything that I'm not exactly sure what a Russian princess would have been doing at Moosehead.
That's why folklore is fun.
Right.
It was probably Anastasia.
Yeah, right. Who got lost with the compass. But Kineo is a whole story, which you can read in Farrar's guide, the whole story about Kineo. In the front, he tells the whole story of Kineo being the great warrior. And he goes on a hunt and he sees a big moose. His mother follows him. So she's in the distance building a fire. And that would be what we know today as Moose Mountain, which was first called Squaw Mountain. That represents her. And then he throws his pack off And that is Little Spencer Mountain. And then the Kettle, Cacajou, the bigger Spencer Mountain, is the Kettle, and you always drop your kettle upside down so water won't get in it and rust it, because you have to eat out of it. So you always drop that face down or top down. And then he shoots the moose, which is supposed to be the body of Kineo, and all those rocks on the side are supposed to be the slab meat from that. That's the basic story. There's different versions of it, various forms of it. And part of it is what I've talked with the Penobscots over at Old Town, and the base core of that is part of their whole legend history. It just takes on different forms with a different writer, of course.
What is the oldest remaining structure in the area?
Know that answer. I haven't thought of that. I mean, camps come and go. The hotels are all gone. All hotels that are there are all new. I was in the last hotel though. I was a little boy, about 8. We hiked the mountain, my uncle and aunt and cousins. I went up the Indian Trail with them while my older brother and cousins went up the chain trail. Do you know about the chain trail? Back in the 50s, probably the early 60s, right up the cliff, there was a chain ladder that hung. And daring people would go up the chain trail. I never went up it. I was too little. And my brother went up it. So we had to go up the Indian Trail. But I remember the end of that day coming back and going inside the hotel. It was dark because it was light outside, dark wood. So I don't remember anything of the hotel. I just remember sitting on the porch with my uncle, looking out over the lake, drinking a orange crushed soda with a paper straw. That's what a little boy remembers, you know. And him telling me about the lake. So.
Did they have any entertainment when you were there? Do you remember any sort of, I mean, was it just a bed, food and board? I mean,
We were there in the middle of the day, so I don't know, but I don't imagine they did at that point have much.
you know, entertainment for people after meals or what have you.
Because that wasn't actually a hotel, that was the servants' quarters. The hotel had burnt down and they turned the servants' quarters into a hotel. And then finally it got abandoned because the guy that had it, it was too much to fix it. So eventually it's gone. There was a B&B on the island. One of the cottages opened up as a B&B, and I took a bunch of my friends from an outdoor club I have here in Boston. And I took 16 people and we went up and took over that whole B&B and had a great time.
But if you think about it, they're going to be getting up early in the morning, so they're not going to be staying up late in theory, right?
They did have entertainment through the years. I mean, basically, you have to understand that it's just like lumber camps in the woods. Hunters would go through and they could stay at the lumber camps if it was between December and March when the lumber camps were open. They could only be open when the ground is frozen because they have to move the logs. The teamsters have to move the logs. And you can't do it when there's mud. So they could only log for 2.5 months, and depending on the spring, how soon it came. But if you were traveling through the woods, you could stay at a lumber camp. You'd be given dinner and everything and a berth. But you're the entertainment because you know what's happening on the outside world. And they're going to be asking you, what's the news in the world? You know, because they get newspapers about every month and they read them 17 times over and over. So that's how they get the information, by people traveling through. Now, the other idea is if you want to stay in that camp, fine. But remember, they lived on a constant diet of beans. Couldn't have been too pleasant. They slept in one big long bed. And if one had lice, they all had lice.
Steve,
Or any other thing that crawled.
And anything else that crawled, right? But they would entertain you because they would sing, they would dance, they would play, somebody could maybe play a fiddle or a harmonica, and they'd entertain you too with stories and everything. So it was always fun to hear about people that go into the lumber camps in those days. Yeah.
Steve,
Yeah,
where did the rhyolite originate?
that I don't know.
Is it possible, I keep wondering, I used to be a rockhound as a youth, amateur geologist, took geology, University of Missouri. Is it possible that a meteor could have created, bringing the rhyolite and created that deep hole at the back of the mountain? I keep wondering that, even though they say that the, glaciers and all of that stuff
Right.
brought it here. I'm not buying.
Well, a few years ago, I was talking with Bob Marvini, the state geologist of Maine, and he was telling me that a young girl who was a geology major getting a master's degree did a study of Moosehead Lake and found quite a discovery. And she went to Bob Marvini and she went to Walt Anderson, the former state geologist, and got them to sign off on it, and they did, showing that tens of thousands of years ago, Moosehead Lake was part of the Penobscot. And then an upheaval occurred, bringing that Northeast Carry section up. The water had to find, because the Moose River was feeding it, had to find a new outlet, and it opened up two outlets, which become the east and west outlet, and the Kennebec River.
Interesting, thank you.
The Kennebec River, the head of the Kennebec River, was the Dead River originally, until that happened and forced the water down to the forks and then merged with the Kennebec. Kennebec existed, but it was, the Dead River was the head of it at that time. So it was quite interesting to find that. Now, Kineo, from my knowledge, it is a push-up. It was pushed up. And then carved off by the
So the rhyolite could have
retreating
come
glaciers.
from deeper and come up. That makes sense to me too.
Yeah.
But I've never bought the fact that it was just carried here because it's not found anywhere else on Earth, I'm told.
Yeah, that's what that's what I understand. It was very valuable to the Wabanakis because they needed it.
Can you say what the name of that rock is again? Or
Rhyolite.
Rhyolite.
RHYL. What is it, Alan? O. Rhyolite.
RHYOLITE.
Yeah, that's it.
Thank you.
Everyone calls it flint, but that becomes. Now, to show you, I told you about how Thoreau and his compatriot, the professor, got there by how long it took them to get there by stagecoach. By 1897, a guy could get out of work in Boston. He could get on a train at North Station. He would get dinner, he would get a berth, a smoking car, card playing car, have entertainment, and then have a berth and go to bed. It would go up to Maine, it would switch at Oakland, and then head straight up all the way to Kineo. Get off, it would get there in the morning, he could get off, take a boat over and have breakfast at the Kineo Hotel. So what went from taking about 3 days to get there took an overnight by train. So things had changed by the 1890s. And of course, the junction there at Greenville is the junction of the Canadian Pacific coming across from Moose River and the Bangor and Piscataquis coming up from Bangor. The Bangor and Piscataquis was being built toward Moosehead, And in the meantime, the French decided to build the Canadian Pacific across, the Canadians, and so it met there. They didn't originally know where it was going to go, or it was just going to go to Greenville and stop. But so later, when you were in Bangor, you had options. You could take the Bangor and Piscataquis up to the junction and switch to the Canadian Pacific, or you could go up the Bangor and Aroostook to Brownville and switch onto the Canadian Pacific and go up to Greenville. So you had several ways to get there after all the railroads got built. And till there isn't anything today left. The Canadian Pacific was the last one that ran, but not anymore. But everything changed.
So you mentioned Benedict Arnold and the map that he used. Were there any major events of the Revolutionary War in that area?
No. Because Arnold, it was just Montressor coming down before that, 1761, down through Moosehead and then back up through the north, the Kerry. And then there's nothing, even the postal roads didn't get over here because they used the old Canada Road to connect with Quebec. And that road was wide enough, so actually every summer, tens of thousands of sheep were marched down that Canada Road all the way to the Brighton Market in Boston. They would come all the way down from Quebec because that was the nearest place you could sell those sheep and make money for them. So I don't imagine the Canada Road was too smell very well. All those sheep. Any other questions?
Road we use.
Couldn't hear you, Harlan?
No, I'm here.
Yep.
Could you tell me what the name of the sporting camp in Caratunk again?
It's a small hotel. It's an inn. They
Oh,
did have sporting camps down on the river at one point.
Oh,
Today they mostly do wedding stuff, but it was originally called the Sterling Inn.
oh, okay. I
Yeah.
know it.
You know it,
Okay.
yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, and that's by far the oldest. I don't know if there's something older on the coast of Maine, because I don't really deal with the coast much, but as far as
Yeah.
inland, that thing is 225 years. It's been open a lot longer than 205 years than anything else.
Thank
There
you.
were
Thank
other-
you. Thank
Yeah,
you.
there were other things built early, but they didn't last. Of course, they're gone. And we lose them. I mean, the Chisuncook House burnt 2 years ago. That's gone. And some of your camps right at Rockwood, your camps up at Beaver Cove, they're closed now. It's hard for them to make a living at it. It's also generational. One generation will run them and then the next one doesn't want to take it over. So they have to sell them or close them and sell them off privately, usually.
Well, let's hope Maynard's lasts for another 100 years because they just celebrate their 100th in 2019.
Yeah. Yep. And so Wilson's, again, is the oldest on the lake that's still open. It's not owned by the Wilson family anymore. It's been sold outside the family, but it's still called Wilson's, and it's continuity. It's never closed since 1865.
Well,
Okay,
All right, thank you, Steve.
you're
Should
welcome.
Seems like everyone has been able to ask the questions that they wanted to ask.
Yeah.
So I really appreciate you taking the time to join us for this event. It was really interesting, for sure. I definitely learned a lot. So with that, I will let everyone get on with the rest of their evening. So thank you.
If anyone
Thank you,
wants to,
Steve.
yeah, if anyone wants to get a hold of me, Laura has my information, how to get a hold
I
of me.
do.
And I'm glad to, you can give it out to anybody that wants.
Sure.
questions.
I put a link to your website in the chat as well.
Okay,
It's oldtalesofthemainewoods.com, and there's also a contact page there.
Yep.
If you're looking to get in touch with Steve, but I can also give his email to you and phone number as well. So, all right. Well, thank you, everybody.
How do we get a hold of you, Laura, to get that information?
Thank you so much.
Here,
It was
here at the Shaw Public Library in Greenville.
Okay,
You can just give us a call or send us an email, and I can get that to you
thank you.
for sure. Yep. All
Good
right.
night,
Thanks.
everyone.
Thanks, everybody. Good night.
Thank you.
Thank you. It was excellent.